afternoon, everybody. I don't need to tell you who I am, but it is my very great pleasure to welcome, with a warm welcome, back to Stanford, Dr. Rafal Felbur, who is the Wissenschaftlicher Assistent in Buddhist Studies at Heidelberg, at the Heidelberg Center for Transcultural Studies at Heidelberg University, and we discussed before how Wissenschaftlicher Assistent should be translated into English, and apparently it should not be translated into English, but it's somewhere hovering in the general region between senior lecturer and assistant professor, but with actually rather heavier duties than that would suggest, right? So, anyway, Rafal is a man of many parts, to say the least, and fortunately they all sort of put together nicely. He has a prose style, which would be the envy of ChatGPT, if you could feel envy. An email from Rafal is a production, sometimes a novel even. And he has, among many other things, the distinction of being the only advisee I've ever had at Stanford to arrive on campus for the first day on his bicycle, which he built himself. And that may not seem very impressive, but he rode it all the way from the airport. And that may not seem very impressive, but the airport in question was LAX, not SFO. And not only that, he didn't come directly, but via Yosemite, right? So that tells you that Rafal is the sort of person who does indeed go the extra mile. He was educated at Warsaw University, where he did an MA in Sinology, and then at Leiden University in the Netherlands, and then he came to Stanford to do his PhD, which he finished in 2018, and his advisors were John Kisznek, Stefano Zacchetti, and myself. This graduation from Stanford was followed by a stint as a postdoctoral fellow at Leiden University, and after that he took up his present position at Heidelberg. He is the editor and contributor to Sūrata-sūtra, volume 1 of that series, and the author of a number of substantial and weighty papers on such things as the Vimalakirti Nirdesha, on pre-Tang dynasty sutra commentaries in Chinese, on the figure of Kumarajiva, and most notably, I think, and meritoriously, a complete translation of the Jiaolun, the treatises of Sangja, who was one of Kumarajiva's Chinese scholar assistants. And this, I might say, was no mean feat, given the subtlety and difficulty of Sangja's prose. So you can see from this brief characterization that the center of gravity of Dr. Felbur's research profile is the study of Buddhism, or Buddhism's literature and its thought as it unfolds in the interplay between the Indian and the Chinese Buddhist traditions. And this can be seen to full effect in his forthcoming study on the Sūrata-sūtra, from which he draws for this evening's lecture, entitled On the Great Bicycle. Excuse me, I'll read that again. In the Great Vehicle, Down Roads Less Travelled, Reflections on the Study of Marginal Mahāyāna Texts, based on the Sūrata-sūtra. So, Rafal, welcome back to Stanford.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much, Paul, for this generous, kind, and, as always, humorous introduction. Thank you to all the wonderful people at the Host Center for Buddhist Studies, to Irene, to John, as well as to Leah Niley and to Miles for making all this possible. Thank you all for coming. It's delightful to see friends and colleagues, old and new. I appreciate your presence very much. Today, I would like to invite you to reflect with me on what in the title of my talk I referred to as marginal Mahāyāna sutras, or as I'll be calling them throughout the talk, forgotten Mahāyāna sutras. What do I mean by this term? By forgotten or marginal Mahāyāna sutras, I mean scriptures that were composed in India, Mahāyāna sutras that originate in India, but which, number one, do not seem to have made a discernible impact on the later Buddhist tradition in India, in East Asia, in Tibet, and number two, have not been taken up for serious study in modern scholarship, forgotten Mahāyāna sutras. And there are very, very many such works. Most of them survive in Chinese and Tibetan. According to one scholar's estimate, I don't know how reliable it is, and perhaps you have more reliable counts, the total number of Mahāyāna scriptures composed in India was roughly 600. Don't know how reliable it is, and it would be great to have a more reliable accounting. The specific number is not so important. What I want to emphasize is this problem. Very many were composed, and yet so far, after roughly more or less 200 years of the academic study of Buddhism, we have reliable studies, that is, editions, translations, and commentaries on a few dozen, more or less. As is well known, scholars have been quite selective in deciding what is worth working on and what to ignore. And so the texts that have attracted most attention so far have been those perceived to resonate especially with Western modernist presuppositions, those, for example, that deal with such topics as meditation or the philosophy of emptiness, or that proclaim an egalitarian religious potential. Those which remain in use in living Buddhist traditions today, mainly in Japan, think the Lotus-Sutra, and those for which there happens to be surviving Indic evidence, either Sanskrit or now increasingly Gandhari, on the premise that these are the genuine languages of original Buddhism. Most of the other scriptures, those hundreds composed in India, not included in these privileged categories, very, very many, still await their turn. Now, my anecdotal observation, talking to fellow scholars, is that among individual scholars and in the discipline of Buddhist studies as a whole, the default and knee-jerk response to this specific problem is essentially not to have a response. It's simply how things are. But I think it is important to ask directly and to try to formulate a response. What should we do about this enormous body of forgotten scriptures? What kinds of insights can we generate by studying them? What challenges are we facing, both in simple methodological terms, but also in broader cultural, political, and technological terms? Think AI, the ongoing attack on universities, resurgent cultural chauvinisms, and so on. Is studying them a form of meritorious activity or a waste of time? So this is the broader question that I wish to raise in my talk today and that I invite you to consider with me. My thoughts are very much in progress, and I encourage you to push back in the Q&A. Well, these are the broad theoretical reflections that I wish to engage in. I will anchor them in the firm basis of a specific textual example of one of these forgotten Mahāyāna sutras, namely the Sūrata-sūtra, which is a scripture that I've been working on for the past several years. My talk will be in three main parts. In the first, longest part, I will have to do a little bit of summarizing and describing, which I usually do not very much like to do, but which will be essential here because Obviously, as a forgotten scripture, it is almost entirely unknown to scholarship. In the second part, I will try to take stock and summarize what I consider to be the distinct, unique understanding of bodhisattvahood, and indeed of Buddhism itself, that emerges from this scripture. It is, I'll try to show, an understanding that, while resonating with elements from better known Mahāyāna scriptures, is not reducible to them. It is clearly laid out, narratively quite compelling, doctrinally rich, even if now completely forgotten. In the third and final part, I will offer some preliminary, broader reflections on the study of these materials and suggest a few tentative reasons of my own why I believe that studying them may in fact be worth our while. The Sūrata-sūtra is a perfect example of a forgotten Mahāyāna scripture. No Sanskrit evidence survives. We have one Chinese translation from the 3rd, possibly early 4th century by Dharmaraksha, and a late 8th, early 9th Tibetan translation. Neither in the Chinese nor Tibetan context did it leave any discernible impact on the later tradition. So we have no or very few mentions of this work in later commentaries, anthologies, adaptations, and so on, which are the standard measures of later impact. And in modern scholarship, there has been an almost perfect zero of interest in this text. So, a forgotten scripture by my definition. But what does it say? Let's take a look. The sutra opens with our hero, our protagonist, the eponymous Sūrata, a poor man from the city, or an urban pauper, most likely reflecting the Sanskrit Nagara Daridra, active on the city streets in the city Shravasti, the capital of the kingdom of Kosala, one of the 2 largest kingdoms in the time of Shakyamuni. Sūrata is out there on the city streets, reaching out to people, dispensing teachings, always surrounded by a crowd of the urban poor, dispensing teachings and inspiring the wealthy and the poor alike with his exemplary devotion to a rather rigorous, stringent form of religiosity, which is depicted as the source of his extraordinary charisma. Later on in the text, not at the beginning, but later on in the text, he will be described explicitly as a bodhisattva. His voluntary embrace of material poverty, of simple food, of humble garb, his humility, non-harshness in body, speech, and thought, his generosity, humility, and compassion and joy, and so on and so forth, make him the embodiment of moral and spiritual gentleness, which is aptly encapsulated by his name, Sūrata, which literally means the gentle one. And here, the contrast with the name Ugra, meaning literally the fierce one, a name which belongs to a much more famous bodhisattva, may or may not be accidental. And right away, for us readers of this text, one striking thing about this Sūrata figure, both as this specific protagonist and more generally as a bodhisattva ideal, is that he does not seem to quite fit in any of the recognized models of bodhisattvahood that we know from better known, better studied Mahāyāna scriptures. And so, Sūrata is clearly not a simple renunciant bodhisattva. An ordained monk who happens to live in a monastery but follows the bodhisattva path. That he is not. Indeed, at no point does this scripture mention or even imply a monastic institution to which this protagonist could belong or with which he could be associated. He is also not a wilderness-dwelling bodhisattva, since he's consistently described as being active only on the city streets. This association with the city is definitive of his identity, not with any wilderness. Well, some cities look perhaps somewhat like a wilderness, but Shravasti does not. Further, he's also not a lay, home-dwelling bodhisattva, a grihin, because that label, grihin, would imply, at the very least, that he lives in a household, while Sūrata is explicitly homeless, sleeps on the streets, eats from a container made of palm leaves, and so on. It would also not be accurate to label him an upasaka, because this, again, would imply a formal or ritual relationship to a monastic community, and again, there is no trace of a monastic community anywhere in the sutra. Clearly, right at the outset, we are entering uncharted territory, embarking upon a path less traveled. But let's continue. Sūrata's charisma is so great that up above, in the heaven of the 33 gods, Shakra himself, the Lord of the gods, is alarmed, fearing that Sūrata is scheming to accumulate such vast stores of merit that will allow him to claim rulership of the whole universe and thus dethrone Shakra. He cannot allow that to happen, and so he subjects the pauper to a series of tests meant to trick him into acting immorally and thus to destroy his merit. Not surprisingly, Sūrata, of course, remains unshaken. Shakra, defeated, is terrified. There is nothing I can do. But Sūrata assures him that his goal is not worldly dominion, which, after all, lacks permanent existence and is like an illusion. Instead, Sūrata's goal is Buddhahood itself. Narratively, for us as readers, this scene of the encounter between Sūrata and Shakra, this scene sets up and offers a kind of preemptive disclaimer for what will come next in the narrative, for as we will see, although here our bodhisattva insists that he is not interested in worldly power, later on in the narrative he will in fact make a rather brazen power grab, as we will see in a moment. But for this to happen, Sūrata will first have to meet the king of Kosala, King Prasenajit himself. The pauper in his shattered robes will be meeting the wealthiest and the most powerful figure in the city. One day, Sūrata stumbles upon a gem, some treasure of immense value. How exactly, that's not described. Of course, he has not used for such a thing himself, so he opts to give it to the poorest person in the city. Much to the astonishment of everyone around, he proclaims in a loud voice that the poorest man in Shravasti is none other than the king himself, his abundant treasuries and overflowing granaries notwithstanding. Sūrata then proceeds to the royal palace to confront the king, whom he finds in the process of, and here the versions differ, either extracting wealth from, basically shaking down, or imprisoning a group of wealthy householders in the city. That's what Pasenadi is doing in the opening scene. So clearly, right from the get-go, the king is presented here as a thoroughly malicious individual. Sūrata will confront him and argue that material wealth and worldly power are in fact spiritual misery and weakness, in effect rhetorically asserting his own superiority. Not surprisingly, the king does not like any of this, and he throws a royal tantrum. He demands a witness to adjudicate the matter. Sūrata says the best witness would be none other than the omniscient Buddha, who conveniently happens to be residing just outside the city walls. Given what we know about Prasenajit from non-Mahāyāna Buddhist literature, from mainstream discourses, from Nikaya and Agama discourses, to me it is striking to see when Sūrata mentions the Buddha, it is striking to see Prasenajit respond by saying, I have not even heard of this Buddha. This is remarkable. Indeed, our sutra reformulates the mainstream presentation of King Prasenajit thoroughly, as I will show later, and this is just one element in this. In mainstream discourses, Prasenajit is an admirer, a supporter, a close friend of the Buddha, and yet here in this Mahāyāna text, the same figure, nominally the same figure, says, "What? Prasena, the Buddha, who is that?" Sūrata summons the Buddha to bear witness on his behalf. The Buddha arrives at once, in style, amid dazzling miracles and surrounded by a vast throng, and unsurprisingly determines in Sūrata's favor, saying that, in fact, Sūrata's spiritual wealth is more than 1 trillion times superior to the king's material riches. Although the king was initially outraged by Sūrata's scandalous proclamations, he now fully accepts them, compelled by the Buddha's authoritative testimony. He exclaims, the king now exclaims, how fortunate his kingdom is to have a figure like Sūrata in it. To which the Buddha quickly adds from the sidelines, whispering into the king's ear, the Buddha quickly adds, in fact, great king, in fact, there are other great men in the royal realm like Sūrata. To us, as historians, as critical readers of a text like this, I think this detail is most revealing, and I wonder what you think about it, since it suggests, to me at least, perhaps, that the bodhisattva figures promoted by this sutra were likely solitary figures, not members of any organized group, and that they lacked social recognition and were actively seeking it. Right? The Buddha has to tell the king, look, king, you did not know that there are these bodhisattvas. There is not just one, there are many. Moved by all this, the king frees the 500 wealthy men from Shravasti, whom he had previously imprisoned or subjected to a shakedown. He lets them go. He abdicates the throne in favor of his son, and then the text is not entirely clear on this point, and I couldn't figure out exactly what is meant here. He cedes kind of passes the control all over his kingdom to Sūrata, asking to become his and the Buddha's disciple. Now, again, all these little details concerning what Prasenaji does constitute further striking departure from mainstream Agama Nikaya presentations of Prasenaji. I will say more about this in a few moments. Before departing, at Sūrata's request, the Buddha gives a sermon to those gathered in Prasenaji's palace, and then he leaves the scene like a king of swans flying back to his palace. The king, who had previously, as we saw, not even heard of this Buddha, is by now so impressed that he yearns to see him again. As soon as the Buddha has left the scene, the king begs Sūrata to bring the king to the Buddha, because Sūrata enjoys that special direct connection. Sūrata agrees, but he doesn't stop there. He tells the king, you, king, must not come alone. You must compel or force your entire retinue to come with you under threat of punishment. Whoever refuses to go with you to see the Buddha must be punished. Again, for us historians, reading a text like this, I think this is another quite telling, fascinating moment. Sūrata has, in fact, arrogated to himself the right to tell the king, to command the king, to wield royal power in the service of religion. You must bring your entire retinue to the Buddha, under threat of punishment. Sūrata then goes on to explain that just as the king, basically giving a justification for why this has to happen, just as the king, also a bodhisattva has a, quote, retinue. But while the king's retinue is limited, small, limited to just an assemblage, a group of ministers, harem ladies, perhaps special envoys and cabinet members who can be fired at will, the bodhisattva's retinue is infinite in scope. Since the bodhisattva is committed to saving all beings, therefore, quote, all beings are the bodhisattva's retinue. And there follows a long list of moral and spiritual virtues that comprise this bodhisattva's retinue. And the term here, most likely parivara, used to describe these virtues is the same word used for the king's entourage, an actual group of actual people over whom the king has actual power. I think this is quite skillful, quite artful on the part of the sutras composers. And it points, I think, to an ideal of the bodhisattva as superior to the king also in the worldly temporal domain, or at least hints at the notion that the bodhisattva, with his unique universal moral appeal, his infinite retinue, can in a sense expand or complement the royal domain of influence, right? And expand it from the narrow parivara, narrow retinue of the king to something far grander, an infinite retinue. That's why the king must bring his entire retinue to the religion, and the bodhisattva, through his presence, will expand it and ensure that it's infinite. Now the king is very happy, finally, and in gratitude he offers to Sūrata a gift of exquisite robes. Again, importantly for us historians, the robes that he gives to Sūrata consist of only two, the upper and the lower garments, which indicates that the recipient of the gift is most likely not a monastic. A monastic would require a set of 3 robes. And this is another clue pointing to the non-ordained status of our hero, of our protagonist. Sūrata, of course, has to reject the gift. He has no use for any such fancy garb, but he instructs the king to donate the robes to, quote, hundreds and thousands of millions of beings in Shravasti, projecting the conceit that a king can become benevolent if transformed by the Dharma. We are now approaching the peak moment in the narrative. Sūrata, the king, and the king's retinue all set out from the king's palace to encounter the Buddha, followed by a crowd of 1 billion poor from the city, the very same ones who had just received the robes in the previous scene, and who in this way, by following Sūrata, express their gratitude for his generosity. Quite literally, the bodhisattva is leading the entire kingdom, the king and the populace, to religion. Now, it may be significant, but perhaps I'm pushing it here a little bit, it may be significant that the meeting between this delegation from Shravasti on the one hand and the Buddha on the other will take place literally, and this is emphasized quite clearly in both the Chinese and Tibetan, the meeting will take place literally in between, halfway between Shravasti, the city, Sūrata's area of operations, and the Buddha's dwelling place in the outskirts of the city. They are literally meeting halfway. I think this detail may be read as suggesting Sūrata's elevated status, which now becomes almost equal to the Buddha. They meet halfway. I'll come back to this point and say more about this later. When the delegation from Shravasti finally arrives at the meeting place, another shocking development. The king gives to Sūrata, to the pauper, his own splendid, decked-out, marvelous throne to sit on. Please sit here, the king says. Everybody's confused, if not to say outraged, especially the gods. They are particular about such things, apparently. What has the pauper done to receive such honors? But Shakra tells them to be patient. Soon you will see proof of Sūrata's virtue. The Buddha reveals to the assembly the full extent of the adornment and beauty, perhaps gunavyuha, of a bodhisattva mahasattva. Like in so many other sutras, the Buddha emits light from his body, illuminating Sūrata's body and disclosing to all those present that its true form is, quote, many tens of millions of times superior to the form of Shakra, the Lord of Gods. This is the Bodhisattva's true form, the Buddha explains, and his poverty is merely a show, a soteriologically motivated spectacle. In fact, the Bodhisattva has power like adamant. He possesses great wealth, but he merely manifests as poor and lowly on the city streets in order to attract beings to religion. Now, if we, as critical readers of this text, look through such normative statements to the social historical reality behind them, which is always a fraught, if necessary, exercise, we may perhaps be able to imagine bodhisattvas who were, in fact, in social and material terms, marginal figures, but who claimed, asserted, this complex upaya-based theology to imbue their fringe status with profound religious significance and to recast it as power. I'll come back to this notion of power in a few moments. Sūrata's glory now on full display, the Buddha gives a prediction, a vyakarana, of Sūrata's future Buddhahood. For us, two moments stand out in this prediction. The first is the revelation that our humble city beggar, whom we now see on the Shravasti city streets, had previously resided in Abhirati, the Buddha Akshobhya's Buddha domain, cultivating his bodhisattva practices over many lifetimes. The Buddha says that eventually he will return to Abhirati to continue his training and one day reach full Buddhahood from within Abhirati, attaining his own Buddha domain, which will be, you guessed it, just like Abhirati. Clearly, the sutra must have emerged in an environment in which knowledge of Akshobhya and Abhirati was presupposed. We have here, perhaps, yet another missing link in the history of Pure Land religiosity. The second remarkable element in the Buddha's prediction is the Buddha's assertion, and I will dwell on this for a moment, is the Buddha's assertion that Sūrata, that part of what Sūrata does, an essential component of his job, is that Sūrata, quote, travels to various lands. The wording is not very easy to interpret. Sūrata travels to various lands to benefit or liberate many beings there. And these lands to which Sūrata travels are described as, in fact, lacking a Tathagata. These are places which are described as lacking or devoid of a Tathagata. Now, what does that mean in social historical terms? That's an open question. But, moreover, not only does he travel to these places, the Buddha tells us, the bodhisattvas or Sūrata's presence there, the fact that he travels there and he's active there, effectively overcomes this absence of Tathagatas there, rendering these places, in effect, quote, not devoid of a Tathagata. And leading the bodhisattva himself, who travels to these places and who renders them, in effect, not devoid of a Tathagata, leading the bodhisattva himself to be venerated in these places by all as the exalted one himself would be venerated. Again, when we attempt to recover social history from a normative text, perhaps we'll be able to say that this detail further fleshes out the notion of bodhisattvas as individual figures, here suggesting that they were perhaps missionary-like figures who would venture to the outskirts of the known Buddhist world, places which are in fact devoid of a Tathagata, where they assume the role of, or expect to be seen as, replacements of, stand-ins for, or surrogates of the Buddha himself. Now the Buddha's prediction is complete, and the scene expands into a cosmic dimension, as Sūrata requests and obtains permission to go forth, only at this very late point in the sutra, pravrajya, from, in the early Dharmaraksha version, from the Buddhas of the 10 directions. From their respective Buddha domains, the Buddhas reach out with their golden arms across the vast expanse of the billion-fold universe and touch Sūrata on the head, whereupon he immediately takes on the appearance of a monk, monastic robes, shaven head. The early version says that the arms did not obstruct each other, which is good to know. Now, I strongly doubt that the point of this scene is simply that Sūrata previously was not and now becomes a conventional monastic, but I'm open to being convinced otherwise. Now, in other, better-known Mahāyāna scriptures, including the Pratyutpanna Samadhi, these Buddhas of the 10 directions are not typically connected with ordination in any technical Vinaya-like sense. Instead, they usually function as witnesses to the Bodhisattva's vows, or perhaps serve to confirm the Bodhisattva's progress. The matter is not clear, and I welcome your suggestions in the Q&A. In any case, with this scene, we reach the final section of the sutra, the final stretch of our less traveled path, the entrustment, parindana section. Now, these will be a familiar moment to readers of Mahāyāna scriptures. In many Mahāyāna sutras, these entrustment sections are predictable, largely uneventful. They consist mainly of the Buddha's usual instructions and exhortations to copy, memorize, propagate, and teach the text in question. But here, in our forgotten sutra, once again we find something extraordinary, and I think quite interesting. Namely, the Buddha, saving the best for last, makes here a startling revelation. Central to this revelation is the notion of the 5 corruptions, the Panchakashaya. The concept of the 5 corruptions points to a particularly degenerate period at the end of an intermediate eon, a period defined by war, famine, moral decline. Sounds familiar? According to such dogmatic works as the Abhidharmakosha Bhashya and the Dājidulud, in principle, during periods of the 5 corruptions, no Buddhas are born, will be born into the world. Because the corruptions are just so intense and so numerous that even if a Buddha were to appear in a world like this, beings in a world like this would be entirely unable to receive a Buddha's teaching, and so the Buddhas just don't bother. In contrast, many Mahāyāna sutras claim that it is precisely in this bleak period of the 5 corruptions that Buddhas appear in the world. They do so deliberately, precisely because it's so difficult, in their infinite compassion or in application of their immense upaya kaushalya. This is the case in the Shurangama Samadhi, the Vimalakirti Nirdesha, the Karuna Pundarika, the Sadharma Pundarika, and both the longer and shorter Sukhavati Vyuha. So it's a well-established Mahāyāna conceit. What about our forgotten sutra? Although ours is, for all intents and purposes, also a Mahāyāna scripture, its position on this point is markedly different from that in those better-known scriptures that I just mentioned. In our text, the Buddha is indeed present in this world or this age of the Panchakashaya, which is in keeping with the position in the Mahāyāna sutras that I just referred to. But, and here is the difference, in our scripture, the Buddha, while here in this world, in this age of the Panchakashaya, he declares that his birth here, his arising, xingshi, his arising here was untimely. He chose the wrong time. Now, he says, is not the right time for a Buddha to be active in the world. In such a world, the Buddha continues, were he to attempt to teach beings here, quote, with the discipline of a Buddha. What does that mean? Or, quote, in accordance with the purview of the Buddha. What does that mean? Then, if he were to attempt teaching beings in this manner, that is from a perspective of a Buddha, then not a single being would be delivered and no dharma would be understood. For this reason, the Buddha concludes, to save beings in this corrupt age, he cannot do it himself. He must delegate this task, the cardinal task of a Buddha, the task of teaching beings, to Sūrata, to the Bodhisattva, who, through his manifestation of poverty and humility, is uniquely qualified to reach beings in a manner in which the Buddha himself is simply powerless to do. In effect, the bodhisattvas of this text seem to assume the role of a Buddha, while the sutra's Shakyamuni Buddha himself steps back from active teaching duty, narrating himself into a position of almost complete passivity. Now, I trust that even this brief sketch of the text's contents has shown that, though it is a forgotten sutra, it engages several themes that are relevant, perhaps even important, in the study of Mahāyāna Buddhism in general. Now, in the second part of my talk, I'll highlight two of these themes which I consider to be central or defining of the vision of bodhisattvahood that emerges from this work. One, the theme of power, and two, the theme of Buddhism on the periphery. The two themes are in fact closely related, as we will see. First, power. Much of the work revolves around interactions between, on the one hand, our main protagonist, who is the embodiment of virtuoso religious attainment, and on the other hand, emblematic representatives of temporal authority. First, Chakra, and then Prasenajit. In dealing with both these paragons of temporal power, Sūrata shows not only that spiritual authority is superior to the temporal, but indeed that temporal authority must rely on religious spiritual authority if it is to achieve the universality and permanence to which it aspires. The universal retinue. To me, I wonder what you think, but to me this sounds in essence like a pretty theocratic argument. Now, in this connection, particularly striking is Sūrata's request to the king that the king must force or compel his entire retinue to go see the Buddha under threat of punishment, as we saw before. Is this code for state-mandated religion? Likewise, connected with the theme of power is the text's remarkable presentation of Prasenajit. As I hinted at in my comments before, our sutra reimagines Prasenajit rather thoroughly in comparison with his presentation in mainstream Agama Nikaya literature. In mainstream sources, Prasenajit is typically a friend and an admirer of the Buddha, the model royal supporter of religion. In contrast, in our sutra, Prasenajit is at first a thoroughly malicious figure, who is not even aware of the Buddha's existence until Sūrata introduces him. Similarly, while mainstream sources depict the transfer of power after Prasenajit as a bloody and tragic tale of anger and revenge, I'm referring to the so-called massacre of the Shakyas episode, our sutra offers instead an episode of harmonious succession. Prasenajit simply voluntarily abdicates. And whereas in mainstream sources, Prasenajit supports the Buddha, is a generous sponsor, he never gives up control over his country to the community of monks. In our sutra, however, in fact, Prasenajit cedes the kingdom. Again, the wording is not easy to interpret, but in effect, Prasenajit cedes, hands over control over the kingdom to the Buddhist presence in his realm. The resulting model is one in which the king is not merely a well-wisher and supporter, a generous patron of the religion, but becomes in effect subordinate to it. This was the first theme, that of power. The second theme, closely related, that of Buddhism on the periphery. Many elements in the work seem to narratively elevate the status of Sūrata, again, both as the specific protagonist and as a kind of general religious ideal, while simultaneously reducing, as it were, the status of the Buddha, or at least reducing the distance between the two, presenting Sūrata as the Buddha's stand-in, the Buddha's replacement, in the corrupt age of the Panchakashaya, as we saw. This dynamic is particularly clear in the entrustment section. Although the Buddha has has in fact appeared in the Saha world as he regularly does in Mahāyāna scriptures. Here in our text, he flat out refuses to teach, and instead he delegates the central duty to the Bodhisattva. This feature is consistent with several other elements that appear earlier in the text. For example, the Buddha does not even appear in the narrative frame until nearly halfway through the text. And when he does, it is because Sūrata summons him to bear testimony on his behalf. Sūrata is central. Having done so, the Buddha immediately wishes to depart, but Sūrata tells him to stay. And it is at Sūrata's request that the Buddha delivers a sermon to the assembly. Again, Sūrata is in charge. When Prasenajit finally accepts the Dharma, he hails Sūrata as his, quote, second teacher, equivalent to the Buddha. When Sūrata leads Prasenajit and a throng of Shravasti dwellers to see the Buddha, the meeting place is explicitly presented as between Shravasti and the Buddha's dwelling on the outskirts. Similarly, in the prediction section, although the Buddha does speak, the focus remains firmly on Sūrata, who is praised in the most elevated terms. It is through Sūrata's activity that all beings will one day be saved. The Buddha plays no role in this drama of salvation other than supervising and describing it. The lands that Sūrata travels to, because of his presence, are rendered not devoid of a Tathagata, and he is worshipped there, quote, just like the Exalted One. In short, to sum up, although the Buddha Shakyamuni, never quite disappears entirely from the narrative, even when he speaks and when he acts, it is Sūrata's presence and Sūrata's agency that remains central. I wonder what you think, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts, but to me all these elements seem to invite us to envision a kind of Buddhism on the periphery, or the frontiers of the settled, established Buddhist world. Again, the Buddha himself declares he will not teach here. Throughout the sutra, he consistently holds back. Prasenajit is unaware of the Buddha until Sūrata informs him, and he does not know that bodhisattvas are present in his realm until the Buddha reveals that to the king. Sūrata's activity is described as traveling to various lands that are in fact devoid of a Buddha and performing the Buddha's duties there in his absence. And again, once again, conspicuously missing throughout this scripture is the Buddhist monastic institution itself and the ordained monk. They're simply not there. Sūrata himself displays none of the outward signs of a monastic. Again, the robes he receives are 2, not 3. At least not until the ambiguous ordination scene towards the end with the Buddhas of the 10 directions. So in sum, in our text, the Bodhisattva appears to be a hero not because he critiques from within the large mainstream monastic institution and retreats into solitary practice, perhaps embracing wilderness dwelling as more authentic, as per the so-called forest hypothesis, nor because he champions lay equality in salvation as proposed in the older lay origins theory. Instead, he appears as a different kind of religious ideal that has not been identified in previous studies of other scriptures. He appears as a solitary poor man on the city streets who, despite or through his material poverty, projects immense spiritual charisma. This charisma, his retinue, makes his teaching especially effective in the age of Panchakashaya, as he transforms the poor, the wealthy householders, and even the king himself, leading them all to the Dharma. In fact, I sense that there is a deeper structural connection between these key 2 themes in the sutra. On the one hand, the theme of power. The ideal king must recognize the superiority of the Dharma and its indispensability for governance, right? The universal retinue must abdicate the throne and in some sense submit to the Buddhist presence in his realm. On the other hand, Buddhism on the frontiers, with bodhisattvas as individual rather than institutional agents, neither clearly monastic nor lay, working within urban environments, almost unrecognized, leveraging their marginality for claims of spiritual preeminence. When we bring these two themes together, I think we might speculate that this scripture originated among adventurous, enterprising individual preachers who found themselves, either by choice or by necessity, far from established monastic centers, perhaps in areas ruled by monarchs who were unfamiliar with Buddhism or where Buddhism had not yet become established. These preachers would then be pitching the Dharma to the poor, the wealthy, and most importantly, the king, in exchange for patronage, and making a rather brazen claim to preeminence. In this light, the statement that the lands that our bodhisattva travels to are, quote, not empty of a Tathagata, as we saw before, may be read perhaps less as figurative praise of spiritual attainment and more as a pretty straightforward job description of the bodhisattva. That is, to go to places, to establish Buddhism where it previously was not. In short, I hope to have shown that this Sūrata-sūtra presents an understanding of bodhisattvahood and indeed of Buddhahood itself, which, while resonating with some elements that we know from better known Mahāyāna scriptures, is nonetheless not reducible to them, is coherent in its uniqueness. A path less traveled, to be sure, but one that is clearly laid out, narratively compelling, and doctrinally rich. But this is just one example of a forgotten Mahāyāna scripture, and to repeat, there are many, many more. To study them all properly would entail an immense expenditure of time and effort if it is to be done properly. This is an enormous practical challenge. Now, in the final part of my talk, I'll reflect briefly on ways in which we may try to address this practical challenge, and I'll suggest why I think the study of such forgotten Mahāyāna sutras may be worth the effort. One way to deal with the immense practical challenges involved in the study of this enormous body of text would be perhaps to rely on the output of such large, well-funded projects as 84,000 and BDK, which are fundamentally religious initiatives devoted to the translation of Buddhist texts into English. Their translations are generally sufficient to provide a workable sense of a sutra's contents. They cover increasingly large portions of the canon and include many of our forgotten Mahāyāna scriptures, so perhaps we can just sit back, relax, and wait for these translations to pour forth. I wonder what you think. I, for one, have some reservations. For all the merits of these translations as responses to religious needs, as sources of employment for perpetually underemployed PhDs, these translations, in principle, and this is not a critique, it's simply a matter of what they aspire to, do not aspire to be works of critical scholarship, although some are clearly very, very good and qualify as such. There is no karmic incentive to collate witnesses, evaluate readings, and compile critical apparatus. Precisely at moments that may turn out to be crucial for our understanding of a text, these translations sometimes smooth things over, creating an impression of completeness and finality, an impression that sometimes can be misleading. Another way to address these practical challenges might be, and it's time for me to address the elephant in the room, might be by harnessing the power of AI. Now, there are many anxieties surrounding this technology, and I share many of these anxieties. Nonetheless, it is hard to deny that AI presents enormous opportunities for Buddhist studies as well. Dharma Mitra has already established itself as a go-to tool, especially for students, maybe not some faculty. ctext.org has just recently, several weeks ago, announced the publication of an automatically AI-generated corpus, translation corpus, of vast quantities of Chinese historical materials. The BDK, from what I understand, but this may not be correct, is soon going to enter the second phase of translation work, one that, I'm told, will be largely automated. Yet I, for one, do not believe that the time is quite ripe for fully automated philology. Human critical judgment remains indispensable. For now, at least, AI is best understood as a powerful helpmate and will likely remain so unless, it may be happening already, unless technology achieves breakthroughs to genuinely independent, creative, and critical reasoning, something like artificial general intelligence, AGI. But if we ever get to that point, I'm afraid that humanity will have more pressing problems to worry about. I think it's neither accidental nor surprising that 84,000 in the BDK have been very enthusiastic adopters of AI. The primary goals are scale and speed, rather than the critical attention to detail that, for now at least, only human readers can provide. At present, therefore, the study of our forgotten Mahāyāna sutras, if it is to be done at all, will continue to demand substantial investment of human expertise. Such work is extremely costly in time and effort and can only be justified if we articulate a clear and compelling rationale for undertaking it. So now, in closing, I promise I'm getting to the end, I will attempt to articulate just such rationale. I don't know if it holds water. Maybe I'm just trying to convince myself that the past 5 or 6 years of my work were not in vain, but here it is. I'll briefly state 3 reasons why I believe that the study of these forgotten Mahāyāna sutras may be worth the considerable cost. First, there is what I'll call a basic positivist motivation, maybe not the sexiest term to invoke, a positive motivation. What do I mean? Insofar as one of our goals as a scholarly community is to advance the understanding of Mahāyāna as a whole, while we remain attuned to recent progress in non-scriptural research, such as epigraphy, archaeology, we simply must preserve in the patient, collective, long-term effort aiming at comprehensive coverage in the domain of text. Even as new manuscripts in Sanskrit and in other Buddhist languages are discovered, the recent finds of Gandhari manuscripts of Sanskrit materials from Tibet, there remain very many of these forgotten scriptures, mainly in Chinese and Tibetan, and they simply deserve our attention. My second argument builds on the calls made recently by some scholars in the field, calls for the development of a, quote, comprehensive grammar of Mahāyāna sutras, a collective disciplinary endeavor that would entail turning away from the doctrinal content of specific individual scriptures and towards a broader consideration of the literary rhetorical devices, stylistic conventions, and performative functions of language use in Mahāyāna scriptures as a genre. Surely, this is a very valuable undertaking, and perhaps a sign that the field has reached a point of some maturity. Indeed, in recent years, there have been some excellent attempts to contribute to such a comprehensive grammar of Mahāyāna scriptures, works by Paul Harrison, Natalie Gummer, Christian Wedemeyer, Alan Cole, Alexander James O'Neill, and others come to mind, which explore such features of these texts as self-referentiality, infinite regress, the use of complex recursive formulae, the fourth wall and its supposed breaking down, narrative interpellation of audiences, temporal loops, and other devices. Still, even as we work on such a comprehensive grammar, we must remember that the evidential basis for any such work remains quite limited. And if this grammar is to be comprehensive, the sample with which it is developed cannot be limited to the Lotus Sutra, the Suvarna Prabhasa, and a handful of other top hits. Now, I do not mean to say that we cannot even start working on this grammar before we know everything about everything. Of course not. But at the very least, we must be aware of the limitations of the sample, and we must make some concerted effort to extend and diversify the sample by reaching for texts outside of our comfort zone. And I think that these forgotten scriptures fit the bill quite well. This is the second reason why I think that at least a selective study of this corpus is a desideratum. And my third and final agreement, and I'll close with this, will draw on the theory of cultural memory as developed by the German theorist. See, coming from Heidelberg, I had to make a reference to German theorists, I'm sorry. Developed by the German theorist Aleida Astmann. Astmann proposed a typology of 4 main forms of cultural memory: active and passive remembering, active and passive forgetting. In our Buddhist context, active remembering corresponds, I think, to processes of canonical selection and of some scriptures as sacred, and their establishment as central to doctrinal and institutional identities. That's active remembering. Active forgetting, which often accompanies the former as the flip side of canonization, can manifest, for instance, as the branding of some works as spurious or suspicious, or even as the physical destruction of books and library collections. Passive forgetting, in turn, happens on its own, passively, when a work, a sutra, simply fails to attract attention and over time is gradually rendered marginal. In fact, our forgotten Mahāyāna sutras belong specifically to this category. It is the concept of passive remembering that I find especially helpful in thinking about our problem. Passive remembering sounds like an oxymoron, right? Passive remembering pertains to cultural materials, cultural resources that are no longer central to present collective identities and present public narratives. This is the passive element. Nonetheless, they are a form of remembering. They entail a degree of activity, of curation, preservation, dissemination. In our case, that would be careful philological study. Here is the crucial difference between passive remembering and passive forgetting. In passive forgetting, the materials in question are increasingly inaccessible and eventually become lost. In contrast, in passive remembering, they are purposely and intentionally made and kept available for activation. This requires purpose and effort. But why does passive remembering matter? In brief, passive remembering offers a repository of alternative perspectives that can be invoked when future circumstances require the constructive function. And it offers a corrective mechanism that can be activated to re-evaluate dominant narratives when they distort or oppress the critical or demythologizing function. I think that so far, the academic study of Buddhism has aligned itself mainly with the forces of active remembering, the prioritizing for study, for research of texts that are attractive in the modern West or those actively used in Buddhist Asia. However, passive, not just active remembering, but passive remembering has a role to play too, which gives these forgotten Mahāyāna texts renewed significance. In other words, we don't have to argue, and I certainly do not argue, that texts like this, like the Sūrata-sūtra, must be immediately rendered or will become immediately attractive in any way and taken up, right, for active use, either in the West or in Asia, right? But I do argue that they must be actively preserved as a repository of alternative perspectives for some unforeseeable future point, or as a corrective mechanism that can be drawn upon to reevaluate dominant narratives. So, in closing, as I mentioned before, we are facing significant challenges, political, cultural, technological, but our situation is fortunate, even enviable. After almost 2 centuries of the academic study of Buddhism, there is still so much more to discover, so many forgotten scriptures to remember, so many paths less traveled awaiting exploration. Thank you. Thank you very much.